symposium this weekend. Continue to inspire the speakers and also make our minds open to hear what they are saying and how it may help us in our lives. We give thanks for the food and the fellowship, and blessings for our youth, and may we continue in your loving service. In your name we pray. Amen.
And please, just
Yes, sir. Did you spend Southern Light? Hello. Hello. I guess I thought this was going to be a large room with lots of people, but I think they were nice and cozy, but I'll say welcome. On behalf of Dr. I want to welcome you to the festival that's sponsored by the Department of Journalism and Media Studies. I want to apologize because I really think I should have been here the first day to extend the welcome, but unfortunately I had previous commitments. But I was glad that when Dean Coleman and the department chair, Professor Jeffries, asked me to come and talk to you today, to welcome you. If you don't know anything, JMS is one of my favorite departments on campus. I think it's a crown jewel. And one of the reasons why I have endeared myself, I think you've endeared yourself to me, is that I think the faculty, you are visionaries. I'm always impressed with your vision of your program. And I think you seize opportunities to provide the students with cutting edge skills. And finally, the thing that I like about you is that you find the most mundane occurrences and turn them into learning experiences for the students. I mean, when I look at the website, I say, who would have thought to do something like that? And I think it's very important for our students. When I was told that the theme of the festival was telling histories, it made me think of something that's happening today, and I hope you understand where I'm coming from, because sometimes when I say this, some of my colleagues get upset. But it made me think of what's happening in the world today. And basically, I think we have a leadership that is making it difficult for us to tell our stories. And by that I mean marginalized groups like Black Americans and other minorities are made to feel that our stories are not important, and it's fake news, and we know that's not. And I think we see this in terms of how we're referred to, and some of our brothers in those S-hole countries are referred to. And I think, some people think that this is not a major concern. But as a friend of mine said to me the other day, we were talking about the situation, and he said to some people these concerns might seem trivial, but they're not. When a government restricts and limits those voices that do not tell the stories as they see it or how they want to see it, the effects can be chilling. All one has to do is look at the history of the Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia. And he said, you might think I'm exaggerating. He said, but it's important for us to look at what's happening in society today and to push back on that. And so I think it's exciting that those people who are presenting today are going to be able to tell their stories from their perspectives, even though it might differ from what we want or what we want to see. So thank you for inviting me, and I hope you have a good day.
All right, so now the moment that we've all been waiting for. So Ms. Jeffries is going to come up, as well as Valerie Boyd, who is our guest. Valerie Boyd is the author of Wrapped in Rainbows. Saw a lot of those books out there. It's about the life of Zora Neale Hurston. She's forthcoming with Spirits in the Dark, the untold story of Black women in Hollywood. I'm anxious for that one. But she is an associate professor and the Charlene Hunter Galt Distinguished Writer in Residence at the Grady College of Journalism at the University of Georgia, where she teaches magazine writing, arts reviewing, and narrative nonfiction. So without further ado, I introduce Ms. Jeffries and Valerie Boyd.
welcome to you and welcome to you all. We have enjoyed our time at this third annual Media Festival, Black History Media Festival, working with the students yesterday and watching films yesterday. And one of the things that came up in the panel discussion yesterday was about preparation. And I talk about this often with my students before they get ready to do something. Like, you've got to prepare, you've got to do your research. So this is an interview that I have been preparing for since 1980 something, because we've known each other since we were both in college. Yes, we met when we were at Northwestern originally, and have crossed paths in lots of different ways, which may come up as we chat. So this is going to be a conversation with me having the opportunity to catch up with an old friend, and to share some of the things that, and ask some questions that I guess I've never asked her about her process and the wonderful things she's doing. So I'm very, very proud and grateful that you came here today.
And I want to say that we didn't prepare for this interview, in that Tamara asked me if I wanted her to send me the questions in advance, and I said, no, let's just make it spontaneous. Let's have a real conversation. So I don't know what is on that paper and what she's going to ask me, but I'm game, so I trust her.
So these are things. So we'll talk, and we want to also make this conversational. So we'll have some chats, and you'll have some questions, and we'll make sure that we have time for all of that a little bit later. The title, I guess people are seeing the little program, Formalizing Curiosity, is taken from a quote attributed to Zora Neale Hurston that is, "Research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose." And so I want to poke and pry a little bit, and I want to talk to her about her purpose in poking and prying. So Valerie, your whole career has been an exercise in formalizing curiosity, from the beginnings of your career as a journalist, and then through your work as a researcher and historian, and now as a scholar and doing the programming that you're doing. Start for our students with the beginning, your interest in journalism, and why you wanted to do that.
So my interest in journalism came about from, when I was a kid. I was like that kid who was always writing the poems that my parents made me read at the family reunion and stuff like that. So I was just the nerdy writer kid. And my parents, who were not college educated, I'm first generation college. My parents, very, old school, working class black people. Both my dad is the son of sharecroppers. My grandparents were sharecroppers. But my parents, like a lot of parents of that generation, knew that education was kind of the ticket, for success. And so they were very enthusiastic about my academic interests. And so when I would write these poems, they'd make me read them at the family reunion, and they encouraged my writing. And so, but like a lot of practical black people, they were concerned about whether I would be able to make a living as a writer.
Yeah, there's that.
So they expressed that concern even while encouraging me to pursue that. And somewhere around 8th grade, I discovered that there was a career called a journalist, and that you could write every day and get paid for it. And that's when I said, oh, that's what I want to do, because that would take care of my parents' concerns so that I can make a living, but it would also give me the opportunity to write and to really pursue my writing. So that's kind of how I got interested in journalism. And that discovery kind of came about because of, there was a famous black woman who was an anchor woman in Atlanta named Monica Pearson. She got married and changed her name to Pearson. And so she came to speak to my 8th grade class, and she was a black woman anchor. She's legendary in Atlanta. And so that was sort of when I realized, oh, here's someone who looks like me, who's doing this, who's working as a journalist, and that opened my eyes to that possibility. And ironically, Monica Hurston retired from WSB in Atlanta, where she was the anchor woman for more than 30 years. She retired and decided to go to UGA, where I teach, to get her master's degree in journalism. And I was her academic advisor. I advised her thesis, and I told her, you're the reason I got into journalism. So now it's full circle that I get to advise you. So it was a wonderful full circle moment for me.
Well, it's interesting, and I wonder what how our students have this experience. The reason that I did not major in art is because I went to Frank Jeffries and said, and I was good at art. I'm like, I'm good at this. I want to major in art. And he said, what are you going to do with that? And I didn't have a good answer. And so if you didn't have a good answer for Frank Jeffries, you went back and you figured out an answer. When I went back, it's like, well, the other thing I'm good at is writing. And there's this same thing. There's this journalism thing, and I can write, and I can do design, and so that will be the art. So, navigating those old school, you better have a job, people, makes you creative in how you do that, and how you make choices for that kind of stuff.
As you mentioned that I did my undergrad at Northwestern University, and I grew up in Atlanta. So to go to Northwestern, which is near Chicago, I mean, my parents didn't know much about college. So I look back on that, and I'm just really grateful to them for, allowing me to go 1,000 miles away to undergrad. I mean, I was 17 years old. I found Northwestern by myself. I applied. I had a great guidance counselor in high school who pushed me in that direction. But my parents were it was really brave and supportive of them to let their 17-year-old daughter go 1,000 miles away to this place that they didn't know anything about. But I say that to say, they really wanted me to go to school at UGA, and it was an hour and a half away. That was what they thought of when they thought of college. And I was like, no, I want to go out of state. I want to go to Northwestern. I want to, and I remember applying to UGA, applying to Northwestern, applying to Syracuse. Those were my 3 top choices. I thought I wouldn't get into Northwestern. That was my reach school. So I promised myself, if I get into Northwestern, I have to go. And so I did, and my parents were supportive of that. But when I started teaching at UGA 13 years ago, my parents were like, yay, you finally made it to UGA.
So you didn't have any kind of pushback from them? Just, here, go, and do?
Yeah, I mean, my dad he was like, I'll buy you a car if you go to UGA, so I could drive back and forth. But it was a promise that I made to myself. So I was pretty determined about it. You know me well enough to know I'm probably in the top 5% of stubborn people in the world. So even at that
She'll be
age,
stubborn on your behalf as well. You should do this.
yes. So I was pretty, clear that that's what I wanted to do, and they were supportive of that. And now that my niece is 18 and about to go to college, I know what that feels like to have a young person going off into the world, and I'm so much more, I feel like I'm more protective of her in ways that my parents, they were protective, but I marvel at the fact that they let me do that. I mean, my parents had never been on an airplane. And in fact, they drove me from Atlanta to Chicago to go to school. So that given their backgrounds and that they knew very little about what college meant, that they trusted my decision and supported that is pretty amazing.
So when you finished Northwestern, did you come directly back to the AJC?
Yes, so when I finished Northwestern, I had done an internship I had done several internships while I was in undergrad at the Macon Telegraph and News, an internship in New York, an internship in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Daily News, which is where we met. Because we were both, we were your age when we met. We were both in college and we were doing internships in Philly. That's how we met. And I wanted to go back to Chicago and work after school. And I went home to Atlanta for, break, summer break, with the intention of going back to Chicago and trying to get a job there in journalism. And my parents really said, they pushed me to, why don't you try the Atlanta Journal-Constitution? Why don't you even go for an interview? And I was hesitant to do it, but, it made sense. So I went in for the interview, and I actually, I went in trying to be, so black on that they wouldn't hire me. I was trying to throw the interview. I wore red, black, and green to the interview. I was like, I'm going to blow this interview so I can go back to Chicago. And then I got the job. And when I got the job, I said, I'll stay here for 1 year and then leave. But fortunately, Atlanta was the kind of hometown that you could go back to. It was big enough that I could, take that job and then find my own way in Atlanta. I remember after I got my first paycheck, I moved out. My dad was like, one paycheck and you're gonna move out? You could stick around for a few months. I was like, no, I'm out. So I moved into my own place and really was able to kind of forge my life as an adult in Atlanta in a different kind of way. So I'm fortunate that I grew up in a town like that was big enough to, contain me and my family. And we could have, distance, but also closeness. And of course, that became more and more important to me as my parents got older. And so I ended up staying at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution off and on for 18 years. I left twice, and I returned twice. And one of the reasons I left was to start a magazine called Health Quest. It was the nation's first nationally circulated Black health magazine in the country, and I co-founded it with Sarah Lomax Reese in the 90s. And then I heavily recruited Tamara to come on as associate editor. I was editor-in-chief. Sarah, my co-founder, was publisher, and we hired Tamara to work with us as associate editor. And then when I left Health Quest to write Wrapped in Rainbows, the life of Zora Neale Hurston, Tamara took over as editor-in-chief. So that's a little bit more of our history.
So we've circled back and forth a lot of different times. That wasn't the first magazine you founded, though.
Right. When I was 25, I founded a magazine called 8 Rock. And 8 Rock is from Zora Neale, that term 8 Rock is from Zora Neale Hurston's Glossary of Harlem Slang. It means a very black person, like the 8 ball, 8 Rock. And of course, Toni Morrison used that term in her book, Paradise. I think that was the book where there was a whole community of kind of 8 Rocks. And so I started this magazine. It was a Black arts and culture magazine. And so I named it 8 Rock because, I was thinking of a black person culturally in terms of our interests and cultural interests. And so it was a magazine that I founded, and I recruited friends like Tamara and others to write for the magazine. It was more than 25 years ago that I started that magazine, and it's there's nothing like the hubris of youth to think, oh yeah, I'm gonna start a magazine. And I did, and it burned a hole in my pocket. I mean, it cost a lot of money to do it, but I was working at the AJC, I had a decent salary, so rather than buy a house or whatever, I was putting money into creating this magazine. And now, more than 25 years later, I look back on it, and it was incredible. I mean, our first issue had, we interviewed Julie Dash from Daughters of the Dust had just come out. And so the cover story was on Julie Dash and Daughters of the Dust, and an interview with one of the stars of the film, Barbara O. So it's like it's an amazing historic, document now. And I recently placed my papers at Emory University. And they were excited to get my papers because here's a full line of all the 8 Rocks that were done. And
How many did you end up doing?
I think we did 5.
And I apologize to you because had I had the energy to go into my attic, I would have brought a copy because I think that I have it somewhere, copies in my attic somewhere.
Yeah, the archivists at Emory hadn't heard of 8 Rock, and when they saw it, I mean, it was this, I mean, we interviewed, over the course of those issues, we interviewed, like, all the major black artists of that time, I mean, who are still people's name, you know, people whose names you know. So Julie Dash, Barbara O, Elin Harris, Bernice Johnson Regan, Cassandra Wilson, you know, I mean, Pearl Clegg, just a number, Jerry Allen, who recently passed away, the great pianist. You know, we were just young people who were excited about black culture. And so we interviewed all these major artists, and we had access to them. Rita Dove, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. I mean, we interviewed all these people and created this really interesting magazine, and some of the people who did artwork for the magazine were just friends of ours, like Radcliffe Bailey, whose art now goes for millions of dollars. Radcliffe did original artwork for the magazine. Tim Fielder, who just had a very successful Black Metropolis exhibit in New York. He's an animation artist. He did original artwork for us. I mean, so when I was preparing 8 Rock to give to the archives at Emory, I kind of went through old issues and made a list of the people who were published there, and it was incredible. Because we were, you know, young people who were just on fire and had a lot of energy, and then now you look at who we have become. And it's, you know, it's pretty impressive. But I say to the students, you know, like, collaborate with each other. The people you meet in college are gonna be your friends for life. They're gonna be, I mean, you can tell, you can look at people, you know that some people are gonna be huge, people are gonna blow up. And you know, they're going to be your friends, and they're going to be people who you can work with and create magazines together, create, you know, podcasts together, create all kinds of things together. Last night in Atlanta, I went to an event. It was a conversation between Pearl Clegg and Tiare Jones. Tiare's book, An American Marriage, was just declared an Oprah Book Club selection. Tiare's my girl, you know, like, she grew up in Atlanta. We didn't know each other when we were growing up because I'm a few years older than her, but we met, you know, later. And so to go and, like, go to something like that and celebrate your girl getting, like, she's about to get paid, you know, and it's like, and there were so many black women in the audience just cheering her on and just being there to celebrate her. And like, and Pearl Clegg is a mentor for me, as she's been for Tiare. Before I founded 8 Rock Magazine, I was assistant editor of Catalyst, a magazine that Pearl Clegg used to edit. And so Pearl has been a mentor to me for, you know, 30 years. So to see people, you know, go through the journey of life and to see all of our successes and to be able to celebrate that with each other, that's something that you all have to look forward to as students. And just, you know, pay attention to the people who have it going on, to people who have skills that you don't have. I remember when I founded Health Quest, I wanted to hire, and we did hire as business manager, a friend of mine from college who, when I was in undergrad, he was in the Kellogg School of Management. And I was like, business skills aren't necessarily my forte, but I know somebody who I trust who can do that. And so we hired him to work with us on that. When it was time to hire an associate editor, I was like, we gotta hire my girl Tam. I mean, like, you know people who are good at what they do. And so you make those connections early in your lives, but you maintain those. And you'll be doing stuff together for decades to come. And that's one of the great joys of, you know, a friendship and, like, really privileging Black excellence, you know? So you note that around you, and then you say, these are the people I want to work with, these are the people I want to build with, these are the people I want to grow with, you know?
I think we talk about that a lot. Who do you surround yourself with? You know, we have this here at Bennett, the sisterhood, but I had a conversation with a student the other day. I said, look around at who you know, everybody is not at the same level in terms of really pushing forward. Some people are still finding their way, and you have to be mindful of who's around you and who's doing things, and are you with people who will help push you if you're still trying to figure out. Look at who's kind of figured it out. And I call it, what'll happen here is, I call it tucking people under. When freshmen come, I'm like, figure out what they, what do you want to do? Let me tuck you under this one who's already sort of headed in that direction, so you can get in her, in the draft and come on through. So at AJC, did you start as arts editor?
So I started at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution I was a copy editor, which was, that was just the kind of role where you're making sure that everything that's printed is well read and that job no longer, it still exists, but it's more crucial than ever. But every time I look at a newspaper or a website, I see typos and errors and things like that. So that is no longer it's not given as much priority as it once was. But that's the job I started out in at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And then I moved into different jobs. I was a reporter on the Southern Task Force, which was a group of reporters who would go around the South writing about interesting stories throughout the southern part of the country. And I did several things, and then for a while I was assistant books editor, and then I eventually moved into being arts editor, which was a great job, and that was like the top job that I wanted. I didn't want to be a manager. I wanted to continue being a journalist. So arts editor was kind of where I topped out. And then after Wrapped in Rainbows came out, I knew I wanted to write more books and have that kind of autonomy. And so teaching became something that was attractive to me because I knew it would give me a little more freedom to do my own work and to write more about Black arts and culture. And like I said, I had left the magazine twice to do different things and then had come back. Left the AJC a couple of times and was able to come back, so I didn't burn any bridges. But when I left the final time, I knew it was the final time because I wanted to be in a situation where I could also, teaching was attractive to me because I was at a point where I wanted to nurture younger writers too. And so teaching has become, I enjoy teaching. I always say if you have to have a job, teaching is it's a good one.
It's a good thing. So, peace out, because we were reminiscing earlier about when certain things happened and when you left AJC and when we left HealthQuest and all that stuff. So you were working at the Journal-Constitution while you did 8 Rock. Those were happening simultaneously.
Right.
But when you started to work on the Zora book, were you still also, because you were also doing the MFA. So she's also the queen of, for those of you in our department, I say to them all the time, feed 2 birds with 1 biscuit. So I got that from her, who got that from Barbara O, who said made the reference to feeding 2 birds with 1 piece of bread. And the piece of bread wasn't poetic enough, so I stuck the biscuit in. So feeding 2 birds with 1 biscuit, and she's sort of the queen of that. So I watched her when she was doing the MFA do freelance articles as she was working on the book, as she was getting the MFA, and all of that went together. Can you talk about what all was going on simultaneously at that time?
Yeah, so the first time when I left the paper, I left I had started HealthQuest. I co-founded HealthQuest, which is, as I said, it was the first Black magazine in the country addressing African American health. Those are some old issues. And I was still working at the AJC when we founded HealthQuest. And then it grew. It was the first Black health magazine in the country, so we got attention in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, So the magazine really grew, and so I was serving as editor-in-chief of the magazine. My co-founder, Sarah Lomax-Reese, was publisher. And so after a point, the magazine grew to the place where I needed to do that full-time. So I left the newspaper in order to work on HealthQuest. And so then I was doing that for a couple of years, I think. And then I got the book deal to write Wrapped in Rainbows. And it was difficult to write this big book, research and write this book, which took 4.5 years of research and 1.5 years of writing. So I knew it was going to be a big project, so it was difficult to do that and be editor-in-chief of a national magazine. So I left HealthQuest to focus on the book, but then I ran out of money, and I needed a job, so I went back to the AJC part-time.
Okay.
And that's when I was assistant books and arts editor, and it was part-time, it was 3 days a week, and I was completing the research for Wrapped in Rainbows. And then it was time for me to really write, and I found it difficult to write and have that 3-day-a-week job. And I asked them for a leave of absence, just for 6 months or so I could finish writing the book. And they said no. So I quit, and I actually ended up, borrowing money from friends and just kind of compiling my situation for initially I thought it would be 3 months to actually just write the book, to finish writing. It took me 1.5 years to finish writing, and
This is before GoFundMe.
yeah. But let me back up and say, when I was at the AJC part-time and had left HealthQuest, but was at the AJC part-time and doing research on Wrapped in Rainbows, that's when I went back to school to get my MFA in creative nonfiction. So I was doing that during that period.
So, okay, clarify. You were writing a book, working part-time, and getting a master's degree.
Right,
Okay.
yeah. And what I did was I used the book as a way, I wanted to use the time writing a book to get rigorous feedback on it. And this creative nonfiction program at Goucher College outside of Baltimore, it was a low residency program, which means you don't have to move to Baltimore to do it. You can live wherever you live, and you write and you send a packet of your writing to your writing mentor periodically, and you get rigorous feedback. So for me, it made sense to do a program like that while I was trying to write the book. So I wrote the first 3 or 4 chapters of the book while I was in the program. And I also wrote several magazine pieces that I got published while I was getting my MFA as well. And so then when I finished the MFA, I was still at the paper, time to really finish and write the book, asked them for a leave of absence, they said no, I quit. I wrote the book, finished the book. Actually, the last couple months as I was finishing the book, I was worried about what am I gonna do, after I finish this book, how am I gonna make a living? And so I was worried about getting a new job, and I got a call from somebody at the AJC who I didn't know, and he said, I'm the new head of the features department, and I heard you're a pretty good editor. You wanna come back? And I was like, great timing, yes. And when I went back as arts editor. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I quit in 2004 to take the job teaching at the University of Georgia. So, and that's it. I was done with the HAC at that point. It was a great job, like I said, as arts editor, but I knew I wanted to teach and really help nurture younger writers.
Who knows? Every goodbye ain't gone. Those of you who have read the book or there are copies floating around, I think that the thing that made me both very proud and also incredibly intimidated when this book got finished was looking at the notes and looking at all of the research that went into this. And, when I was there, not necessarily physically because we were living in Atlanta for part of the time, and then I was in Philly for some of the time that you were working on this, crossing paths in different ways. but I remember your travels and going to different places. Can you talk to us about the research process that goes into doing something like, this kind of biography? And let me say also that this was, it has been called the definitive biography. When I talk about Valerie and talk about this book, I say it's the biography. It isn't obviously the only one, but as far as I'm concerned, it is the one. And I think that maybe the first thing we should say is, can you talk a little bit about when you decided to do this, why it was time to do a new Zora biography?
Yeah, so like a lot of you probably, I read Their Eyes Were Watching God. You all, the students, probably read it in 11th grade, probably AP English. I didn't read it until I was in college. So Their Eyes Were Watching God is Zora Neale Hurston's most famous novel. It was written in 1937. I read that book when I was a freshman in college, and I was blown away by it. I was amazed that somebody could have written a book in the 1930s that still spoke to me so urgently across the decades. And it's the story of a woman named Janie becoming herself. And, she is 16, when the book starts, and I was 17, 18 years old when I first read it. And it just really touched me and moved me. So I became a Zora Neale Hurston aficionado. I became a Zora head, like I had all the t-shirts and the coffee mugs and all that Zora stuff, and just a real interest in Zora Neale Hurston. And I also was kind of mad that it was college and I was just now discovering this book. Like I had read Baldwin and I had read Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and other great writers, but for some reason I hadn't read Hurston. So she felt like hidden to me. And I felt like, in a way, she was like a literary grandmother. Like she was the missing link. So if Alice Walker is my literary mother, then Zora Neale Hurston was my literary grandmother. And I felt that almost kinship with her. And I started reading everything I could find by and about her, including a biography of her that had been published in 1977 called Zora Neale Hurston, A Literary Life, I think it's called. And it was by this author, this white guy named Robert Hemingway, who was a scholar. And I read that book, enjoyed it, learned a lot about Hurston, and like I said, I became a Zora head. And I went on with my life and my career as a journalist. And then I saw a little ad in Essence magazine, and this was like 30 years ago now, advertising in 1990, I think it was either 89 or 90, the first Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts in her hometown, Eatonville. And because I was such a fan and felt like she was a literary grandmother, I said, I'm going to go to this festival. And I went to that festival with 3 friends. We got in a car, drove from the 8 hours from Atlanta to Orlando. Eatonville is just outside of Orlando. Went to that Zora Neale Hurston Festival. Had a lovely time. It was small. It was a small festival, maybe 100, 200 people there. I mean, like, it was so tiny, you couldn't lose your friends. Like, you could literally, like, yell across the place where they had a little outdoor festival. You could yell across for your friends to bring you a fried fish sandwich from the ladies at Macedonia Baptist Church. It was so tiny that it felt really like family, like home, like all the hardcore Zora heads were there. I remember Alice Walker was at their first festival, Ruby Dee, Zora Neale Hurston's niece, Lucy Hurston. So you got to meet people who were at that festival and who were as devoted to Hurston as I was. And then it was so magical that I said, I'm gonna go back every year. I'm gonna make this an annual pilgrimage. So I started going back to that festival every year. And then at the 1994 festival, something really magical happened for me, because it was at that festival that Robert Hemingway, Hurston's biographer, said something that changed my life. He gave a talk where he critiqued his own book, pointing out things that he felt he had missed because he was a man writing about a woman, because he was a white American writing about an African American. And he said, it's time for a new biography to be written, and it needs to be written by a black woman. And I felt my heart jump, you know, I felt an inner calling. I mean, I knew, I was like, oh my God, that's me. But I was scared. At that point, the longest thing I had ever written was maybe a 5,000-word magazine article. So the idea of writing a whole book, and especially a book on someone as important to me and important to everybody as Zora Neale Hurston, was just frightening. And I don't know what you do when you're scared, but what I do is like nothing. Like I freeze. So I just kind of froze with that knowing. And it was weird because I remember Bell Hooks, the great, you know, feminist thinker and writer, was at that festival, and she came up to me and said, you know you ought to do that, right? And I was just like I had just met Bell Hooks and she's saying this to me. So it was this almost spiritual moment where I knew, like, he's talking to me, like I should do that. But again, I was scared, so I didn't do anything about it. I didn't say anything to anyone. Maybe I told one or two friends about that, what Toni Morrison calls a knowing so deep, that inner knowing. And I said to myself, maybe in 10 years I'll be ready to do that. And about a year and a half later, totally out of the blue, I got a phone call from a New York literary agent saying he was looking for someone to write a biography of Zora Neale Hurston. And was I interested? And that felt like Zora herself, you know, like the big finger of fate was pointing at me and saying, yes, you. What you felt was real. You need to do this. And so when he called me and asked me if I was interested, I felt like I had no choice but to say yes. And so he ended up walking me through the process of how do you get a book deal? How do you do this? And so I ended up working on an extensive book proposal, kind of outlining how I would approach the book differently from the 1977 biography. And remember, I heard the author of that book talk about things he felt he'd missed because he was a man writing about a woman. He was white, a white person writing about an African American. For instance, something he said he missed was like, when he was doing his biography, he interviewed Hurston's literary friends, who were mostly men. So he was doing his research in the 70s, and a lot of folks were still alive. Hurston lived from 1891 to 1960. So he's doing his research in the 70s, so he interviewed people like Arnabon Thomas and other literary friends of hers. What he didn't do was interview her women friends, because it didn't occur to him that as a woman, maybe her best friends would be other women who weren't necessarily literary people. Like, for instance, she was good friends with Ethel Waters, the singer. Ethel Waters was still alive in the 70s when he was doing his research, but he didn't bother to interview her. So there were things like that he pointed out. So when I was working on my book proposal, I went back to my notes from his talk in 1994, and I kind of looked at things that I would do differently. But his book was amazing, and it was a roadmap for me. I wouldn't have been able to write Wrapped in Rainbows if he hadn't written that book. That became my guide. I mean, I used it literally almost as a roadmap to know who I needed to interview, what I needed to cover, which wrong turns he had taken, and which roads to avoid. The biggest problem with Hemingway's book is that he was fooled by Zora Neale Hurston's lies about her age. She always presented herself as at least 10 years younger than she actually was.
And that's do we all.
Yes. And so the most frequent birth year that she cited was 1901. And because it was the one she used most frequently, that's the one he went with. It's wrong. She was actually born in 1891. And it wasn't until after his book came out that other scholars discovered the 1900 census and that she was 9 years old, not unborn as she claimed. So his book is off by 10 years. And so that's the biggest issue with his book. But also because he, was trying to solely write a literary biography, he was, and I think because of the racial and gender difference, he was a little bit too gentlemanly about getting into her life. When I was doing my research, when I decided I was going to write this book, he was one of the first people I contacted. And I said, remember that talk you gave at the Zora Festival? Well, I'm that black woman who's going to do this. And he was the most generous scholar. He invited me to visit him at the University of Kansas, where he had become the chancellor. And when I went to visit him there, his assistant greeted me, and she said, those are the Zora file cabinets. There's the copy machine. See you later. So he gave me access to all this material, all those interviews he had done with people, including Bruce Nugent, who was her roommate and good friend during the Harlem Renaissance, and a good friend to Langston Hughes, and could talk about that relationship. Bruce Nugent was no longer alive in the 90s when I was doing this research, but I had access to Hemingway's interviews. He had a 3-hour interview with Zora's first husband, Herbert Sheen. He had all this material that he gave me access to. And at the end of my week there, after I copied everything and had full access to everything, he and I sat down together for dinner. And, he just wanted to know what I thought about everything. And I was teasing him about being too much of a gentleman. Because, for instance, in that Bruce Nugent interview, he was talking, he and Zora had been roommates for a while, and he was talking about a relationship that she had that he felt was unhealthy for her. And Hemingway stopped him in the middle of the interview. He said, oh, no, my interests are purely scholarly. And I'm like, let the man talk, And he would stop people because he was only trying to write a literary biography. So biography had changed since the 70s. I was trying to write about the woman in full. I was trying to get in her shoes, get inside her skin, and write about her from the inside out. And I felt capable of doing that as a black Southern woman myself. I think he felt like he needed to keep a kind of distance because he's a white man writing about a black woman. And so he didn't want to hear about this relationship. But to me, that seemed important in that it would inform, for instance, the relationship she wrote about between Janie and Tea Cake in Their Eyes Were Watching God. So I wanted to hear everything. And there were things that he did allow people to say in those interviews that he didn't really use in his book, in the way he wrote his book. So there was a lot of material that I could use differently from the way he used it so that my book could be quite different from his. And in fact, once Wrapped in Rainbows came out, Hemingway paid me the greatest compliment. He said that he learned more about Zora from reading my book than from writing his own. And, that was one of the things that inspired me to write Wrapped in Rainbows the way I did was something that I found in his papers. There was a letter to him from Alice Walker that was part of his papers on Zora. And when he was writing his book in the 70s, Alice Walker was also discovering Zora Neale Hurston. And you all know that when Zora died in 1960, she didn't have a lot of money, and there was not enough money for her funeral. And so the community in Fort Pierce, Florida, where she lived, took up a collection. And so they had a lovely funeral for her, but there was not enough money for a headstone. So Hurston was buried in an unmarked grave that remained unmarked until 1973, when Alice Walker, who was then only 29 years old, this is way before The Color Purple, way before she became a famous writer, but she was moved by Zora Neale Hurston's work, and so she made her way to Fort Pierce, Florida, found Hurston's grave in this segregated, weed-choked cemetery in Fort Pierce, Florida, and with her own money, bought a marker for the grave, proclaiming Zora Neale Hurston a genius of the South. And she wrote about that in an essay in Ms. Magazine in 1975. And that essay is part of what jump-started the Hurston revival, the revival of interest in Hurston. So in the 70s, Alice Walker was working on this essay and figuring out who Zora Neale Hurston was. Robert Hemingway was working on this biography. So they were like the two Zora heads in the world. So they were like writing back and forth to each other. And I found this letter in his papers from Alice Walker saying to him, I want to know what kind of food she liked to cook. I want to know what kind of flowers she liked. I want to know about her as a woman. Like, that's what she wanted. So I made it one of my goals when writing Wrapped in Rainbows to be able to answer those questions for Alice Walker. So I can tell you that one of Zora's favorite things to cook was shrimp and okra, which is a uniquely kind of Florida dish. And she liked to, at parties, she liked to serve cornbread and buttermilk because it would fill people up really fast and, you know, it was cheap. So I tried to figure out the answers to those questions. So that letter became a guiding light for me to make sure that in my biography of Hurston, you don't just learn about her literary life, but you learn about her life. You learn about her, you know, her life as a woman and how that informed her work as an author.
So that's a question that came up with us on the panel yesterday, because we're talking about, this is sponsored by a journalism program, and so we're talking about true stories. But then we'll talk about your program. You know, what we're dealing with now is this genre of narrative nonfiction, creative nonfiction, and what I think has been fascinating for some of my colleagues who are in other areas is people who are able to write about something scientific, like the Henrietta Lacks book. I had a colleague say, "Oh my God, she's not a scientist." I was like, "No," but she understands the science, but she's able to write this book that feels like a novel. So one of the questions was, how do you do that if you are bound, as we are in journalism and narrative nonfiction, to tell true stories? How do you get those details? Where do you find the shrimp and grits? What is the process of putting the color onto the facts, making it not just facts but truth, a full truth?
Yeah. So I direct a program at the University of Georgia. It's a program in narrative media writing, and we have a track in screenwriting, which one of my colleagues directs, and then a track in narrative nonfiction, which I direct. And I created this program just a few years ago. We just graduated our first class. It's a 2-year low residency MFA program. So we have our third cohort in now. So the program just started, I guess, 3 years ago. It is now, and it took about 5 years to get it up and running because of all the red tape at the University of Georgia. But when I started this program, I consciously chose to name it, our track, narrative nonfiction rather than creative nonfiction, because I wanted to attract journalism students like you all. I wanted to attract mid-career journalists, and I believed that using the word creative would make journalists think that meant you could make stuff up, and they wouldn't be attracted to that. One of our unofficial mottos in the narrative nonfiction program is, we don't make shit up. Like, it's gotta be real. And you have to figure out how to get those real details, because we are the first MFA program based in a college of journalism in the country. And because we are in a college of journalism, there is no fuzziness to that line. We are not doing fake news. We are not making anything up. And so I have to be very hard line about that with my students, because it is in a college of journalism. And we've actually had guest speakers come in and talk about changing the color of their father's eyes in a memoir. And I'm like, no, we don't do that. Like, why change his eyes from green to blue? I mean, like, oh, blue sounded better. No. And I've had to challenge those speakers and say, no, that's not what we do here, because this is in a college of journalism. It's a narrative nonfiction program. We're not making anything up. But then the question becomes, well, how do you get those telling details? That's in the research. That's in, like, so you asked me earlier about the research on Wrapped in Rainbows. So my research on this book, as I mentioned before, it took 4.5 years of almost like full-time research, crisscrossing the country, going to various archives where Hurston's papers are housed. The research was two-pronged, research in archives and interviewing people who knew her. When I was doing this research in the 90s, she died in 1960, so there weren't a lot of people still around who knew her as, a peer. Her nieces and nephews and people like that were around. Her peers were really old at that point, you know, and so I tried to interview them first because they were in their 90s and I knew that time was limited. So I interviewed them and then I did all this archival research where I was going to the different places where her papers are housed. Everything that was in her possession at the time of her death is at the University of Florida in Gainesville because that's where she had willed it to go. A lot of her correspondence with friends from the Harlem Renaissance is at Howard University in DC. A lot of her research as an anthropologist and folklorist is at the Library of Congress in DC. Several of her original manuscripts are at the Beinecke Library at Yale. So I'm going to all these libraries, researching, looking at these papers, and then I'm also interviewing people who knew her. So here's how you get the details. You look very carefully at everything in the archives. Her letters to friends were a great source of details. You know, that's when you see her planning for a party and saying, yeah, I'm gonna serve them buttermilk and cornbread, because it'll fill them up fast. Like, you can see things like that in the archives, especially in letters. So she and Langston Hughes were writing letters to each other the way you send texts to your friends. You know, they would write postcards to plan lunch together, whereas we, you know, do that by text now. And I'm convinced that our biographers, like 50 years from now, when somebody's writing a biography of Tamara, they're going to have to sue AT&T to get access to her texts.
No, they're not, because all my stuff is on paper.
Okay, but you and I have done some texts. Do you print them out?
Sometimes.
Yeah, good. So she's a historian. She's already thinking about future generations. But I mean, and it's not going to be 50 years from now. That's going to happen in the next 5 years. What if I wanted to write a biography of Whitney Houston and I wanted I wanted access to her texts with Bobby Christina. That case is going to come up in the next 5 years, and it's going to be precedent setting because we don't write letters the way we used to, but we write texts, we write emails, we write a lot. I mean, we actually write more to each other now than we talk on the phone, but it's in electronic form. And so future biographers are going to need access to our texts and everything. When I said I placed my papers at Emory recently, I didn't print out emails, but they wanted me to. But I did not do that, but I gave them 2 old computers. I don't even know what's on those computers now. Like, they were old. But I gave them those, and they were like, if we find any sensitive information, we'll contact you. If we, you know, we'll erase your social security number if it's on there. But there's stuff on those computers that's part of probably some emails that back and forth. All of the Health Quest stuff, when we were working on Health Quest, is on one of those computers. That was that's part of my archives now. It's digital. So that's where you find the details about people's lives in their correspondence and the stuff that they're saying to their friends. You know, and you have to, like, and also in the interviews. So when I would interview people who knew her, like when I interviewed her niece was like 75 years old, and this was a niece who had lived with her. The niece's name was Zora too. So little Zora had lived with her Aunt Zora after her mother died. Little Zora's mother died. Zora's only sister, Sarah, died when little Zora was 10 years old. And she went to live with her aunt for a year. And then her father remarried, and then she went back to him. But she lived with her aunt, her cool literary aunt, for a year. And so 60 years later, I'm interviewing her. And instead of asking her, well, what, you know, like what year, like Tamara was asking me, well, what year did you leave this? And like, I can't even remember something that happened in 2000. So how's somebody going to remember something that happened in 1932 or something? So rather than trying to get details about dates, which you can get from the archives, I use those interviews to get details about the person. Like I remember, I asked her niece, do you remember what your aunt's closet looked like? And she said, yeah, she like, everything was white or red. And then when you look at photos of Zora Neale Hurston, she's often in white. And so getting that kind of detail from her niece, like, oh, her closet was white, her favorite color, you know, to wear, you know, those were her power colors, white and red. Those kinds of details are the things that I tried to get from interviews, from people who knew her. I would ask them, like, you know, what was it like to go to a party with her? Or, you know, what did she smell like? I mean, crazy questions like that people would be like, what? But it helped me to fill in the human being. You know, the archives give you the records and a lot of details sometimes. There was a detail that I found in a court document. Later in her career, I don't know if you all know this, but Zora Neale Hurston was falsely accused of molesting a 10-year-old boy. It was a false charge. She was out of the country when the alleged incident took place. And this almost devastated her. It almost broke her. That she was in her 50s and she's, you know, having to go to court on this ridiculous charge. And the court documents had been sealed, and Hemingway didn't see them when he was writing his biography. But by the time I was working on mine, the court documents were available. So I had to file a Freedom of Information Act request to get the documents, and I got them. They came in the mail, it's a big stack of documents, and I looked through them, prepared to, I mean, what if I found she was guilty? I mean, I was prepared for whatever I was to find there. Of course, she was not guilty. It was, you know, there were it was, like I said, she was out of the country when the alleged incident took place. But I looked through those court documents and I mined it for detail. And one of the telling details I found was on the first day of the trial, she wore a red scarf. And I saw that because the prosecutor asked the little boy to point out the person in the room who he was accusing. And he pointed to her, and the prosecutor said, "You're pointing to the woman in the red scarf." And I was like, whoa, she wore a red scarf to this, she's charged with this heinous crime, something she would never do. And the fact that she wore a red scarf showed that she was not broken. She was feeling victorious. She was like, I'm going there as myself, fully myself. And that was such an amazing detail that I was able to pull out and present, you know, in the book. And that's how you write true stories that read like novels, because of the level of detail that you look for in the research, both in the archives but also in the conversations you have with people about the person you're writing about. And, you know, like the Henrietta Lacks book, I know Rebecca Skloot, who wrote that book, and she worked on it for like 10 years. You know, doing all that kind of detailed work and trying to understand the science in a way that she could explain it to, you know, all of us, you know, who are less familiar with that. So, but to me, that's what I love about narrative nonfiction. I love the kind of fidelity to facts that you have to have. I love that constraint. Like, you cannot make anything up, but you can still, your challenge is to still make it beautiful, still make it rise to the level of literature while keeping true to the facts and seeking a larger truth, you know, through the artful storytelling, you know? And I love that challenge, because it is a challenge. I mean, I know writing novels, writing fiction is hard, but you can make anything up. But with narrative nonfiction, you can't make it up, but you can still make it beautiful.
A folklore friend of mine who had done genealogical work talked about having to, he's irreverent, he was like, you gotta go to the records, you can't just talk to people because they're gonna lie. The family's gonna lie. And so he always talked about being able to connect what was in the record with what people said, because people are protective of their family members, of their friends, and I'm not gonna out this person and that kind of thing. So making that connection between the document and the oral histories and that kind of thing is important.
Yeah, and also understanding what stake people have in having the story told a certain way. You know, like writing about historical figures, so somebody like Hurston who died in 1960, the people who were still alive who knew her had certain relationships with her. The only reason I'm interviewing them is because they knew her and they're still alive. Like maybe her best friend wasn't still alive. So the person I'm interviewing, like when I interviewed Louise Thompson Patterson, who had been in the middle of the dispute that Zora Neale Hurston had with Langston Hughes over the play Mulebone. So when I interviewed Louise, she was 96 years old, living in a nursing home in Harlem, and still mad with Zora. So I had to understand her perspective. So when I said to her, what do you remember about Zora Neale Hurston? She said, the only thing I remember about Zora is that she was crazy. But I had to put that in context. They had a rift. They started out as friends, they became enemies. So yes, it's great to have the perspective of the enemy, but you don't just take that and say, oh, Zora Neale Hurston was crazy because this one person said so. You have to understand what that person's role was in the life. There's a famous Floridian, Stetson Kennedy, who, lived to be like 200 years old. So he was like the last one standing. And Stetson is somebody who a lot of people interviewed about Hurston because he knew her. And Stetson, he's a white writer who kind of he wrote a kind of an expose of the Ku Klux Klan. That's one of the things he's famous for. But when Stetson knew Zora, he was her boss for a summer job that she had with the Works Progress Administration. And he talks about Zora like, oh yeah, she was irreverent, she wore pants, she smoked, all these kinds of things about her. And people kind of take that as gospel, but Stetson was like 20 years old. She was in her 40s, though presenting herself in her 30s. And he was this young kid who was her boss. So she was, she was like, this boy isn't telling me what to do. So she would go to work when she felt like it and all that. So when he tells you this is the way she is, people kind of take that as gospel, like, oh, well, she wasn't a very responsible worker. She was like, please, this guy's my boss. So you have to, that's why you do check it against the archives, because I see letters where she was writing to friends saying, they got this little 18-year-old white boy as my boss, right? Like you have to really kind of supply the context so that you're presenting it that way. And the other thing about Stetson, he was, like I say, he was like 250 years old when he died, so he was the last person standing, and he would try to make you think they were closer than they were. And I have been a mature black woman with a young white boss, and we were not close. So I understood that and tried to give it that context, right? So I think that's important too, rather than just take people's word for it because they either are protective of their friend or, in Stetson's case, trying to make the friendship appear closer than it was, and you have to really go back and check the records and say, well, wait, what was their real relationship? I think that's important to do too.
So the last thing, because I have no idea what time you're here, and we can do this for the rest of the day.
Yeah, we want to hear from you. We want to have questions.
The last thing that I will ask, and you touched on this a little bit about the magical things that happened. One of the things that when I interviewed Oprah and George Wolfe about making the Henrietta Lacks film, which we looked at yesterday, was the things that happened where both of them said that they felt that Henrietta Lacks was present, that her spirit was present at the, in the filming, that certain things would happen on the set, and things would get blocked or things would open up, and they thought, yep, that's Henny, that's Henrietta. Where was Zora in your process?
So I mentioned that Zora Neale Hurston, that first festival being kind of magical. One of the magical things that happened at that first festival was, like I said, it was really small. So everybody who was there kind of, we kind of became a little community. And one of the things that people started to notice was that there was this big bird at the festival. Like the festival is partly a kind of academic conference and then partly like a street fair where they have vendors outside selling, food and jewelry and whatever, artwork. And so at the outdoor part of the festival, there was this big black crow that was kind of hanging around all the time. And people started calling the bird Zora. People would just be like, oh, there's Zora, there's Zora. So that became kind of a running joke of that first festival. And as I told you, that first festival was like tiny, like 200 people were there maybe. That festival has grown over the last 30 years. At the last one I attended, which was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they estimated the crowd at 200,000. So people, I mean, there's a big traffic jam of people trying to get from Orlando to Eatonville for the festival now. So it's become this huge thing. And so when I was working on my book, before I actually started the book, I decided that even though I felt that knowing, when he said it's time for a black woman to do this, I felt like it was me. I believed that it was important to kind of ask Zora for her permission to tell her story, because she was that kind of woman. And so I remember telling my literary agent, who's this no-nonsense New York guy, like, I'm going to ask for her permission. He was like, how are you going to do that? She's dead. And so I went to visit her grave, that grave which was easy for me to find because of the work that Alice Walker had done to mark it in 1973. So I went and I found Hurston's grave, and I went there to seek her permission. And I don't know what I was expecting, but I just felt like this was the right thing to do. And so I took some Florida oranges, because she loved those. I took some money, because she never had enough in her lifetime. And I took some Pall Mall cigarettes, because that's what she smoked. And I gave those offerings, I put those offerings on the grave, and just kind of silently said a prayer asking for her permission to tell her story. And a couple of friends had gone with me who were at that first festival and who had heard Hemingway say it's time for a black woman to write a biography of Zora. And so as we were getting up to leave, a friend of mine said, I think you got your permission, because this big black bird came and circled the cemetery, just like at that first Hurston festival. And so there were things like that happened along the way, like from that moment on, getting that sign, which I did take it as a sign that I had her permission. The rest of the journey, I felt her presence in that whenever I would get stuck on a question that I couldn't answer about her, she would actually come to me in dreams. And we would just like talk in the dreams, and I would just remember that I had a dream about Zora Neale Hurston. Like, I wouldn't be able to remember like asking her specific things in the dreams. I knew I could ask her anything in the dreams, but what would happen is I would remember, oh, I had a dream about Zora Neale Hurston last night, and then the next day I would find that answer that I was looking for. I would find it in an archival document, or I would just get past that puzzle somehow. And so I felt her presence in that way a lot. And then I remember this is going to sound crazy, but so part of what I did when I was writing the book was, I live in Atlanta, and I have, I had a nice home at that time with a nice writing, office where I had worked on Health Quest, and I felt like that was going to be the office where I would write this book. But I ended up being unable to write really in Atlanta, because suddenly I had so many friends I needed to go to lunch with, or so much laundry I needed to do, whatever, to procrastinate and not do it. And so I ended up feeling drawn to Florida, and I ended up going to Sarasota, Florida, where I knew one person who I could go to lunch with if I needed to, but I didn't have the distractions that I had in Atlanta. So I ended up going to Sarasota, and I wrote much of the book there. I ended up staying there for about 6 months. Actually, I was there for 3 months, and then the season started. I was on the beach in Sarasota. So I had a lovely condo on the beach, but when the season started, I couldn't afford it anymore. So I had to move. I moved to Hilton Head because it was off season there. And then the season started in Hilton Head, and I couldn't afford that anymore. So I went back to Sarasota, and that's where I finished the book. And so my habit was to treat it like a job. I would get up every morning. I would, meditate, have breakfast, turn on the computer by 9 o'clock, and just work. Have a quick lunch. My reward for a good day's work was a sunset walk on the beach. And, you know, the west coast of Florida, I don't know if you've been there, but it has spectacular sunsets. Like, people literally applaud the sunset every night because they're so beautiful. So I would check online and figure out what time is sunset. You know, okay, it's in 15 minutes. I quickly change my clothes, get into my walking clothes, and go take a walk on the beach and be there for sunset. I always learned to take a notepad with me so that I could take notes, because during that walk, things would come to me. That would be where I would have the breakthrough, where I would kind of understand something or remember something I had read 3 years ago that was going to be crucial now. I remember on one of those walks, the last line of the book came to me. I was like, I know this is going to be the last sentence of the book. I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I know this is going to be it. So, you know, things like that. So I would take notes during those walks. And I was finishing up the book, you know, in the condo in Sarasota, and my editor at Scribner, who was excellent and just fantastic and supportive, she was going on vacation, and she had seen most of the book. I had been sending her chapters, so she had seen everything except for like the last 2 or 3 chapters, and she was going to go on vacation for like 2 weeks, and she said, you know, can you get me the last 2 chapters before I go on vacation? So I was trying to finish it quickly and get those to her before she went on vacation, and I tried to like pull an all-nighter and like finish, and I assure you, when you are over 30, you can no longer pull an all-nighter. It's just not physically possible, you know? So I did it, but then I was like crazy the next day. Like, I couldn't even, you know, function. And I remember calling her, and I'm saying, Lisa, I've been with this woman for 6 years and she's about to die. I can't rush it. I cannot get you, you know? It was the final chapter I was writing, and I ended up, the final chapter was the resurrection of Zora Neale Hurston, because I didn't want it to end on her death. But that was one of the things I had to write, and I was like, I cannot rush this. You know, and she said, I completely understand, of course. So she backed off, she went on her vacation, so I had 2 more weeks to just take my time and finish. And that last week, I was working on the end, and I remember hearing this loud noise outside the condo, and it was so loud, it was a bird cawing, and it was so loud that I had to like open the door and see what was going on. And I looked out, and there was this big black crow, just like the bird that we had seen at that first festival. And I just said, hey Zora, I'm almost finished. And I went back in, and the bird went away, and I finished the book with that, again, blessing. I felt like it was a blessing. It was her coming to say, I got you, you got this, you can do this. And so, yeah, that was my journey. That was my journey.
Does anybody in the audience have questions, or do you have questions for anybody in the audience?
I know you all have questions. I told someone, this is my favorite part of this kind of conversation, because I don't know what you're going to ask, and the questions are always really interesting and make me think about my work in a different way. So this is the part that I look forward to.
Hello, I'm Gloria Portman. My question is, when you were getting your master's and you were writing the book and you were working at the agency, how did you find time to balance everything and time for yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's always a good question, because you do have to find time for self-care so that you are, you know, bringing your best self to your work. And so for me, you know, I was part-time at the newspaper, I was working on the MFA and working on the book, but the work on the book was research. So having a part-time job allowed me to have the flexibility to travel rather than a full-time job that I had to be at every day. So that gave me the flexibility to travel, to do the research. But in answer to your question more broadly, I think it's important that we have community, that we have friends that we can call on, that we can talk to about what's really going on, and also talk to about our ideas, you know, to really support us in our ideas. It's important that we have, you know, like our girls, like people our own age, but I've also valued the importance of having mentors, of having, you know, older women that we can turn to for advice who've been through things that we have yet to go through. So when I said earlier, like, pay attention to your classmates, pay attention to the excellence you see around you, and make sure that you stay in touch with those people, I would say do the same for your mentors. The teachers who, you know, who move you and who listen to you, you know, stay in touch with those folks, because having mentors throughout your life, even at my age, you know, like Charlene Hunter Galt, who was the first black student to graduate from the University of Georgia. You know, Charlene is in her 70s now and is a mentor to me. Alice Walker has become a mentor to me, and I'm working on a book with her now. I'm editing her journals. She started writing journals when she was 18 years old, writing in personal journals, keeping journals. She turned 74 yesterday. So there's more than 50 years of personal journals that she's given me permission to read, and I've been reading those journals for the past 4 years, and I'm editing them into a collection that's going to be published late this year called Gathering Blossoms Under Fire. But then, you know, so I get the privilege of reading her personal journals, which is crazy and amazing, and it's going to be a great book to inspire all of us. But she also has become a personal mentor. Monica Pearson, who I mentioned earlier, the WSB anchorwoman, legendary, who was the reason I became a journalist, and then I got to be her thesis advisor in her master's program. She's a mentor to me. So I would just say it's important, part of self-care is having a community. Making sure you have people that you can go to when you need help, when you feel like you're not sure. That's part of the balance to me. And also, you know, taking time to, like, not do anything. Like, I can veg out on, I can do a Queen Sugar marathon. Like, I can just, people think I'm so driven and I'm working all the time. I can just totally, you know, like, let's just binge watch. You know, sometimes that kind of thing is what you need, that kind of downtime to really get your head straight again. And also, like, binge watching something like Queen Sugar, or, you know, there's a lot of things that we could name. I haven't looked at Black Lightning yet, but that's next on my list. Like, this is great storytelling too. So it can inspire you as a storyteller as well to see other people bringing excellence to what they do. You know, that can be not just binge watching, but inspiration too, while being relaxing, you know. So find out what helps you to relax, but make sure you have your people around you, people that you can, you know, just chill with, and also people that you can confide in and, you know, have support from, people of all generations. And then, of course, it's important to give back and mentor younger people too. Yeah.
Who else has a question?
Hello, my name is Destin Collins. I have 2 questions to ask. My first question is, has anybody ever compared your work or how the way you work as an author to Zora Neale Hurston? And my second question is, have any of her friends and family members disagreed upon you writing this book about her?
Disagreed about me writing? Mm-hmm. So Hurston didn't have children, but she had 7 siblings. So she has a bunch of nieces and nephews. And so I ended up meeting and being in touch with all of her nieces and nephews when I was working on the book. And they were very supportive in different ways. You know, there are two nieces who are at odds with each other, and they're both kind of in charge of the estate, so I had to navigate their relationship. Like, one of them gave me permission, like, oh yeah, you can do the book, you can do whatever you want, whatever. And this was early on, and I didn't know, like, so then the book deal, I had the book deal, and it was announced in Publishers Weekly. You know, it was a big deal. It was the first biography of Zora Neale Hurston since 1977. So people were excited about it. And so this announcement came out in Publishers Weekly, and I got a call from this other niece who's like, I'm in charge of the Hurston estate, and you didn't come to me. Lucy, her other niece, hadn't said anything about Lois, like, because they're at odds. So this was blind, you know, I was blindsided by this. But I ended up becoming really close to Lois, that niece who called me and said, what about me? She ended up becoming probably my greatest ally in the family. And she is a retired educator in Tampa, and who's very serious about managing the Zora Neale Hurston estate and making sure the family gets their due and that kind of thing. But Lois also is very, like, she understands what this kind of process is like. So nobody ever asked me, like, we want to see it before you publish it, or we want to make sure it only says this. They were just very supportive. And the only thing Lois said to me was, if you find anything disturbing, please just show me first. Not like you can't publish it, but just show me first. I just want to know about it before it comes out. And so, you know, we had a great relationship working on the book throughout. She still calls me. In fact, I have to return a call from her today, because she still calls me about questions about the family tree. Like, she'll say, now was Aunt so-and-so, like, I know more about the Hurston family tree than I know about my own family tree. So Lois will call me with those kinds of questions. And you know there's going to be a new Zora Neale Hurston book coming out. Do y'all know about that? It's called Barracoon. It's a book that she started researching in 1929. And she interviewed this man named Cujo Lewis. And he was on the last slave ship brought over from Africa. And she wrote this manuscript about him. And the ship docked in Mobile, Alabama. And she met Cujo Lewis in Mobile, and she interviewed him, and she went back several times over years and interviewed him and wrote a manuscript about him that has never been published, but is coming out this May. And so Lois, the niece, called me a couple of days ago and left me a message wanting to fact check something about what years Hurston interviewed Cujo Lewis. So I had to call Lois back to, you know, answer that question for her. But, you know, I have to go back and look at my book. I have to look at the endnotes, because I don't carry all this stuff in my head anymore. So I have to look at the endnotes and look back at my notes, and then I can answer her question. But so I've been able to maintain a good relationship with the family. And they were pleased with the way the book turned out. People haven't really compared my writing style necessarily with Hurston, but one of my goals in writing Wrapped in Rainbows was to make it feel like Zora and I were sitting on the porch telling you her story together. So one of my goals was to make sure her voice came through in the book. So before I actually started writing, after I had done all that research and you know, left Atlanta and it was time to really write, the first thing I did to figure out the voice of the book was I reread all of her books in the order they were written. Because I wanted to immerse myself in her voice, in her way of talking, because I wanted to make sure her voice came through in the book. And so I think, you know, I think it does, part of why it's so readable is it does feel like storytelling. Like, I really wanted to privilege storytelling. You know, a lot of biographies can be really boring. You know, like Zora Neale Hurston was born January 7th, 1891. Like, I didn't want to start the book that way. I wanted to start it in a way that was her telling, like us really seeing her and feeling like we were in a story. And I think that's what narrative nonfiction can do. It's like taking the facts, but making them transcend just their factual base and become the details of a fascinating story. And Zora Neale Hurston was nothing if not a great storyteller. So it would have been like morally wrong of me to write a book about her that was boring and that wasn't steeped in story. And so that was one of my goals in writing it and bringing her voice to the fore.
Thank you, Ms. Boyd. I want to ask two questions, primarily about the photos. The photos were just remarkable in the book, but I'm always curious about the photo that was misidentified as Zora Neale Hurston. And then this photo, why did you decide to put this photo of Zora at the football game at North Carolina Central on the front?
So when I was doing the research, I mean, part of the kind of research you do is you're interviewing people who knew her, but you're also trying to find, documents like photos. And so I went to North Carolina Central to interview some of her former students there. She taught at North Carolina College for Negroes, which it was called at that time, briefly, just for one semester. And so I met several of her former students, and they talked about, her and her conflict with the president, Dr. Shepard, which is why she was only there for one semester. One of the students told me the reason she was only there for one semester is that she was dating a student. And he pulled out the 1939 yearbook and said, it was John Ellis, it was John Ellis. And he showed me a picture of John Ellis. I tried to find Mr. Ellis, of course, but he was no longer alive. When I'm interviewing these students of hers, they were in their 80s by this time. And so one student who had worked at the university, he had been he was a communication student, and he took a lot of photographs, and he ended up working for the university for, the next 60 years as a photographer and head of their public relations department eventually. The first day I went to interview, I met with a group of those former students, and he said, I think I have a photo of her. I'll bring it tomorrow. So I met with them the next day, and he brought that photograph that's now on the cover of the book, and he said, you can have it. But I saw that photo, that photo had not been seen before. I mean, I had studied all the photos of Hurston. That photo was a new photo to me. And when he said, you can have it, I said, no, Mr. Rivera, let me pay you for this photo. So we made a deal, and I paid, I made sure he was paid for the photo, because I knew the moment I saw it, I want this to be on the cover. And what I love about the photo is that, so it was a black and white photo originally. And when I told my editor, this is the photo I want on the cover, my idea was to colorize her and make her stand out, because that's what struck me about the photo in the first place. Everybody else is sitting and she's standing, and they're all so sharp. They were at a football game in 1939, but they were dressed to the nines, and I was impressed with that. And I said, tell me the story of the photo. And he said, I was just walking through the stands, and I said, Miss Hurston, can I take your photo? And she stood up, and I took the photo. That was the only story. But to me, it felt like a metaphor for her whole career. Like she was part of the people, but she was also beyond the people in a way. And so her standing while everybody else was sitting said that to me. And then that white dress, which she always wore, and then I asked the designers at Simon & Schuster to colorize her, only her, so that it would feel like she was in the 21st century, while everybody, to bring her out for us as contemporary readers. And so that was my idea, and they executed it beautifully, and it turned out to be like a great kind of memorable cover. But the moment he showed me the photo, I was like, whoa, that's the cover. And I even had to argue with with the publisher about it a little bit, because they wanted to do an illustration on the cover. You remember in the early 2000s, late 90s, all the Zora Neale Hurston books were reissued, and they had the same kind of illustration cover. They wanted to use that same illustrator and do that kind of cover. But I argued that this is a biography. This is a true story. I don't want it to look like all of her novels. I want it to look like this is about a real person. So I want a photograph of her on the cover. And so I successfully made that argument, and then when I showed them this photo, they were like, okay, and I said, why don't we colorize it? They were all in, and they did a good job of it. So it's a cover that I love. I have a, you know, I did a big event at when the book first came out, and the people who sponsored the event did a big blow up of the cover and got a big poster. So now I have a big poster of it, you know, in my house. So it's like, it's become an iconic photo. And some people actually think that she was, like, they don't get that, oh yeah, we colorized it. Because it feels so real, like that's how she comes to us, as a fully colored, fully, you know, alive human being. And then the other question about the photo that was misidentified as her, that photo just always seemed like, that doesn't look like the same person. So I was always suspicious of that photo. And then when I was doing the research, I found a note that had been ignored in the archives. I think it was at the Library of Congress, but the note was from Alan Lomax, who had been a young researcher who knew and worked with Hurston. And he had just written a note like, this is not Zora Neale Hurston. And people were ignoring that and continuing to publish that photo. And so I felt like, okay, this confirms my suspicion about the photo. So let me just write about the photo and just kind of try to make that story clear, that this isn't her, and it, you know, it was someone who's misidentified as her. But that photo became one of the famous photos of her. But if you look at it closely, as I did, examining it closely compared with other photographs from the same period, it's clear that it's not her. But it was someone, there's film footage of that same woman that Zora Neale Hurston herself shot, and that film footage is available at the Library of Congress. But I think it's kind of cool that this unknown black woman has, you know, like, people have posters of her in their houses. Like, it's kind of cool. It would be cool to, you know, I tried to actually find out more about her and who she actually was, because that would be a cool piece to write, like the not Zora photo, like, who is this real woman? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Robert Williams. I teach political science here, and I have a couple of questions regarding the interview process. One, what is the most interesting interviewee that you had, or interview? And two, did you encounter a situation where you had to coax out information from someone whom you were interviewing?
I think, so one thing that I learned when you interview old people is you can't really, you just have to let them talk. Like, and that's good for interviewing anybody, really. Like, I tell my students, yes, I want you to interview this person, but I also want you to spend a day, at the very least an afternoon, just hanging out with them. Shadow them. Go with them to the grocery store, go and just do what they do. Just shadow them in their lives. Because sitting across from somebody and saying, well, what about this? And do you remember this date? And that's not where a story comes from. Yeah, they'll tell you, oh, this happened in 2000 or whatever, as best as I can remember it. You'll get information from an interview, but you don't get story. And so part of what I've learned about interviewing is that it requires patience. And it's not about, you can't go into it in a transactional way. Like, this is what I want to get from this person, and I got 30 minutes to get it, so let me just get it. Like, you have to spend time with people, especially, with the older people that I interviewed for this book, I had to just, see them multiple times. Like, when I went to interview Louise Thompson Patterson, she was living in this nursing home, and her daughter said to me, she has good days and bad days. Sometimes mornings are better, sometimes afternoons are better. She shouldn't be eating sweets, but she's 96, so she can do whatever she wants. Take her some sweets, because she loves sweets. So I just would visit her at different times of the day, and I'd bring sweets. I remember, like, the first day that I visited her, she was talking about Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes as if they were still alive. And so then the second day I went to visit her, I took some photographs of them and was asking her questions about them as if they were still alive. I asked her something about Langston Hughes, And she said, oh, he's dead, you know. So she was more alert and with it that day. But it was a matter of taking that time and spending, you know, having several interviews over time, and then also just sitting with people and asking questions in a way where you don't have the tape recorder in their face, but you're just talking. And that's when the best stories will come out, I've found. And so, to me, that's the best way to kind of gently coax information out of people, because you're not really trying to just get information, you're trying to get story. And so, it doesn't feel like coaxing so much as it feels like just hanging and letting life unfold a little bit. And then once people start to trust you, you can kind of ask them anything, you know? And sometimes you can develop that sense of intimacy very quickly with someone, and sometimes it takes more time, and you have to be intuitive enough to kind of gauge that. I mean, I tell my students, you know, like, be like a sensitive human being first. Don't just go in with your agenda to get these questions answered. You know, like, sit and I mean, look at the photographs in the person's office. Ask about their granddaughter or whatever, but ask sincerely. Don't ask just to, you know, break the ice and get your answers. Like, really become interested in this other human being who's allowed you into their life for the moment, and really try to get to know them a little bit better. I think that's the best way to really, you know, those are the best interviews, when you have a real kind of guided conversation and you spend some time just watching people be themselves.
Most interesting?
If you don't mind me asking. I've had some. I think one of the I would say the most thrilling interview I ever did was with the great novelist Toni Morrison, who I consider the greatest living writer. Yeah. So I remember I was interviewing her. And it was a 30-minute phone interview. They said she only has 30 minutes. So you get to interview her on the phone. She's got an appointment after the 30 minutes. You cannot go any longer. So I'm talking to her on the phone. The 30 minutes happen, and she says, oh, I hear the doorbell ring, and she says, oh, my appointment is here. You know, I have to go. And I said, I understand, I know, it was only 30 minutes. And she said, can I call you back? So I had told all my friends, like, I'm interviewing Toni Morrison. So after 30 minutes, they all started calling me, like, how'd it go? And I was like, she's calling me back, I gotta get on the phone, bye. You know? And she called me back and we talked for another hour. And that was an interesting interview because it was focused on Toni Cade Bambara, who was a great writer, had recently passed away, and Toni Morrison was finishing Toni Cade's last book and publishing it. So it ended up being an interview about their friendship. Toni as an editor, Toni Morrison was finishing, doing some tucking and editing and maybe a little writing to finish up Toni Cade Bambara's last book. But we ended up talking about the loss of her friend. And that was an interview where we had this accelerated intimacy. Of course, I had read everything Toni Morrison had written, and I was, I just had to do everything I could to keep it together and not just babble on the phone about how much I loved her, but I kept it together as a professional, but there was a connection because of my love for her work. And then she was very vulnerable and, talked about losing her friend and losing her mother recently, and it ended up being like this accelerated kind of intimacy where she wanted to keep talking with me. And that's why she called me back, and then we ended up talking, for another hour. And then at the end, she said she was going to do an event in New York in honor of the publication of this book with Bill T. Jones, the great choreographer. And she asked me if I was coming to that, and I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, well, make yourself known to me, dear. And so when I went, I felt like I had promised to do that, so I had to make sure she knew I was there and everything. So I got invited to a dinner with her and a bunch of other people, which I had a bunch of my friends with me who were too nervous to go. So we ended up going to the dinner just to say hello, but not sitting and, joining them for dinner. But when you get past the gatekeepers, because the publicists were the ones who said, oh, she's only got 30 minutes. When you start talking to the real person, you find out they're a real person. And if they like you or there's a connection, they will say, oh, yeah, let's continue talking, or yeah, come to this dinner or whatever. So that's why I tell my students, just be a human being first. Make that connection. And then, the story will unveil and unfold itself,
Have you done your Hemingway moment with the art?
I have not, but I do think, I think there's never, like, my book is thought of as the definitive Hurston biography, and it may be definitive for its time, but some of these students are going to write another biography of Hurston, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, that will in a way supplant my book, because it will provide a post-feminist, post-hip-hop, post-Black Lives Matter movement look at her life, which we will need in 10 or 15 years, you know what I mean? So I'm all for that, and that's part of why I placed my papers at Emory, so that they would be accessible to a young scholar who wants to go and look at my papers as I looked at Hemingway's papers and see how they can build upon the scholarship on Hurston based on what I did. And I've had younger scholars come to me and ask me, can I access your material? And I've opened my home to them. But now it's publicly available, and anybody can go and look at that material and see what they can glean from it to build on their own scholarship. So I do feel like that's important, to kind of lay the groundwork and the foundation for what continues to be an ongoing conversation about everything, right? Like, it's something may be definitive for the moment, but the conversation will continue. I don't have the last word on Hurston. None of us has the last word on anything, because life goes on, and future generations will have their say too. And I welcome that, and I'm glad that my work can contribute to that ongoing conversation.
Ma'am, I just wanted to ask you, my name is Keith. Now, when you go back and to expand on that, the picture, that you were going to receive it as a gift from an older gentleman that had it, why would you prefer to pay for it instead of just accepting it as a gift? Just curious.
Good question. I knew I wanted it to be on the cover of the book, and I wanted to make sure Mr. Rivera got paid for his creative work. I wanted to make sure he got, the credit for the photograph, and also that he was properly paid for it. Like, I knew this was going to be on the cover of a book, and it was going to be a photo that was then going to be widely, used. And if I had just taken it as a gift, then I felt like I would have felt like I wasn't honoring him by paying him for his work. And so that's why I said to him, Mr. Rivera, let me pay you. Let's make this official and formal, so that he got paid and got recognized for his artistry.
Was that Alex Rivera?
Yes.
Yeah.
Alex Rivera.
And basically sells it.
Yeah. Yeah. And
I'll say it's also as far as legal, it rights to that photo.
yeah.
The older gentleman might have forgotten that, I'd given that picture to you, and said, well, I never did. I was putting it on loan, so that.
Yeah, no, I wanted to make it formal, for legal reasons, but mostly for credit reasons, because Alex Rivera, he's a famous writer especially in the a famous photographer in the Raleigh-Durham area, but also that was his life work, and I wanted to make sure he was fairly compensated for it. And I think that's important when we are telling our historical stories, to make sure that we are fair to the people who allow us their photographs or their stories. Make sure we're fair to them, and so that was just me being an ethical journalist by saying to him, "Oh yeah, let's make sure we paid for this," because I knew that it was going to become a famous photograph. Yeah.
I want to thank you all for being here, and especially thank you, Valerie, for coming and being in this space and filling the space with your wisdom and history and knowledge and your love.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Hey, so everybody, it's about 3:40. Appreciate everybody coming out. In about 20 minutes.